how can we become stewards of the commons? And what is the commons, right? And really everything around us is the commons, right? The air that we breathe, the water on this planet, the land base, the land systems, the bioregional aspects of where we live. It helps us look at what our impact is and what our responsibility is there, how to make our human communities work. Can we give what we're capable and able, and can we receive what we need, right? And these idealistic ways of thinking about how we're all in this together, which most spiritual traditions from around the world will say that we are all one. We're just living under the illusion that we're separate. And when we step into community mindedness, we start to live and practice that reality. So how can we really look at the gifts that we have to bring and the needs that we're trying to meet in community and make those conscious and become sort of custodians of the communities that we step into to bring more cohesion there.
All right, so again, welcome everyone. My name is Lauren and I'm the program director here at the Foundation for Intentional Community. I am your host for this session, so if you encounter any tech issues or otherwise need assistance, please don't hesitate to send me a private message in the chat and I will be more than happy to assist you. All right, now I'm just going to introduce our special guest today, Lee Warren. Lee is a devoted community builder. She is delighted by community of all kinds, shapes, sizes, and intentions. Her life purpose is to provide leadership in the building of community in accessible, natural, and blissful ways. To that end, she is committed to reweaving the cosmologies as well as regenerating the cultural wisdom that allows for us all to return to the village. The village is a metaphor for the collaborative approach to life that will repair historical damage and create a sense of coherence and unity. Cultural repair looks like conscious relating to self, to land, to dying, to living, and to other. As we return to the village, we create cohesive, supportive, inclusive, and life-giving systems that tend to the whole, most especially to the more than human world. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to the wonderful Lee. So Lee, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Lauren. Hey, everyone. Yeah, this is a little bit of a taster for the upcoming Becoming a Communitarian course, which starts, as Lauren said, on the 5th. And I guess we're on Facebook land as well as live here. So yeah, I can just say a little bit about how this course emerged. So I have been living in land-based intentional community for close to 30 years. And I've been in Western North Carolina at a place called Earth Haven Eco Village since the late 90s. And I'm sort of there pretty part-time these days. After 30 years in community, I'm living more of a mainstream town life than I ever have. But I love being able to share some of the pieces that I've gleaned over those years in the trenches and community. But this course, Becoming a Communitarian, I used to call it for a while, Thriving in Community. And it sort of grew out of this interesting place where we watched people come into our eco village and sort of struggle. Sometimes the struggles were on the physical level, the chop wood, carry water aspect of community. And sometimes they were on the financial level of like, gosh, how do I live and make a living in rural intentional community? But often the majority of struggles came from navigating the social world of community and trying to find a place, a sort of sustainable, long-term place in the scheme of sort of a close-knit community. So this course, I created it to sort of try to explicitly mark the intra and interpersonal realms, which folks often navigate when they come into community and they have to start relating to more people in more complex ways. So yeah, we start the course, and I can just go through a little bit of the structure of the course if do you think that would be helpful, Lauren? Okay,
yeah,
great.
that would be great. Thank you, Lee.
So it's a 5-part course. And the first part, I talk quite a bit about the biological and cultural landscapes that we come from. And I like to think of us as cosmological orphans, which is we don't really have a cohesive origin story, and we don't really understand how traumatic the culture can be to us and our tender and sensitive nervous systems and biologies. And so when we enter community and we're really looking at holistic and healthy and related and intimate frameworks on so many levels in robust ways, we come having to unlearn as much as we have to learn. And so the first week we really spend some time with how our brains are wired, what emotional regulation looks like, how trauma can impact us. And we learn this phrase called window of tolerance. This is a really important concept when we're navigating community. And then we sort of also look at the cultural pieces, which is the systems. In every system of our lives, we have sort of an upside down and backwards approach to human-centered sort of regenerative ways of being. So in community, we're trying to repair that. We're trying to do significant culture repair. And so it's really helpful to understand the landscape of where we're coming and where we think we're going, because there's a bit of a gap there. So we really lay the groundwork in the first week. The second week of the course is, I call it community, the celebrations and the challenges, and really to sort of deepen in to look at what are we celebrating? What are the joys? Why are we drawn to community? And there's some ecological, spiritual, economic, governance-based reasons why. And then we focus a lot on the social, emotional, relational components, because that's often a huge motivation. Is like, hey, why am I out here doing life by myself when I could be doing it in community? And yet, and there's so much that can draw us to community in those ways. But there's also lots of challenges and opportunities, right? There's a lot of steep learning curve. There's a lot of people to navigate. There's a lot of conflict to navigate. And some of these sort of biological and cultural challenges show up in where we might be mismatched. So that's sort of a deeper dive look at that. And then part 3, week 3, I call the right relationship to the collective. Where do we want to be in relationship to a collective, whether that's, being on a board of our co-op or having a group of friends on our block where we share infrastructure, or actually living in a land-based intentional community, or even an urban intentional community. So we explore this model I call the zones of intimacy to figure out how close we want to be with other people, outside of our maybe nuclear families or outside of our partnerships. And then we look at sort of the reparative, regenerative, and wisdom-based practices that can help us navigate the collective. Because the collective is really a new world for many people. And there's some helpful attitudes that we can think about, sort of deeper time, and how to sort of build these projects as sort of modern day cathedrals. So that's week 3. And then week 4, we really immerse ourselves in this idea of the self-care, self-literacy model. The more we know ourselves and the more we are able to stay in our own seat, this is this phrase from Arnie Mindell, the more we can take care of ourselves, the more advanced relating we're going to be able to do outside of ourselves. So a self-knowing process, using some personality testing models. I love the enneagram, but there's also the multiple intelligences model and love languages model and neurodiversity models. And then how do we communicate ourselves to others? Once we get sort of literate and knowledgeable about the self, how do we navigate that as we sort of are in the land of the bumper cars of community, where we're bumping up, rubbing up against other people and the sort of rock grinder that it can be community. So as we learn to become adults in relationship and say, hey, this is who I am and what I need, who are you and what do you need? So sort of really more sophisticated negotiation and navigating our lives as adults. So there's lots of really rich stuff there. And then the part 5 is building intimacy with others. When we have our foundation in ourselves, when we know where we're coming from, when we have a sense of why we're in community, then we can start to shift towards more intimacy on more satisfying levels with other people around us, and varying levels of zones of closeness and distance and community. So lots of really good healing influences here, and ways to think about, and one of my passions is to open the doors to possibilities. I have lived one life mostly in one community, but there's so much going on out in the world. And so this is a little bit of an introduction to what's possible. And then watching people do what they do and find what they find. And we really do. We build community through this 5-week course and sink in together and really share some best practices and best approaches, and just really how to be moving into this thing called communitarian, right? And then part of the title of this course is becoming a communitarian. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what that word means to me. And I think of this word as a steward of the commons, right? How can we become stewards of the commons? And what is the commons, right? And really everything around us is the commons, right? The air that we breathe, the water on this planet, the land base, the land systems, the bioregional aspects of where we live. Even our federal government, even though it's sort of big and unwieldy, it really was created to serve the collective. Is its highest intention. So what it means when we become communitarians is that, hey, I want to be a conscious steward of the things that I touch in my life. And if that happens to be in community, and in many ways, we're all in community, we're nested in circles of community. It doesn't have to necessarily be residential community. But it helps us look at what our impact is and what our responsibility is there, how to make our human communities work. And we can take this to any level, sort of the classic Karl Marx saying, from each according to her ability, to each according to her needs, meaning, can we give what we're capable and able, and can we receive what we need, right? And these idealistic ways of thinking about how we're all in this together, which most spiritual traditions from around the world will say that we are all one. We're just living under the illusion that we're separate. And when we step into community mindedness, we start to live and practice that reality. And so how can we really look at the gifts that we have to bring and the needs that we're trying to meet in community, and make those conscious and become sort of custodians of the communities that we step into, to bring more cohesion there. And I was even thinking about this week. One of the beautiful things I've learned over the years in community is something called the grief ritual, that we learned from a beautiful elder named Sobanfu Some. And she's passed on now, but she comes from a community in Western Africa in the Dagara tradition, where she says all grief is the grief of the collective, all joy is joy of the collective, which sort of takes this idea of communitarian to a whole other level, which is we're only as good as those among us who are suffering the most, right? And so how do we start to think ideally in smaller ways, until then we can grow the muscles to think of it in bigger and bigger ways? But even in our small ways, we're only as solid as the least among us. We're only, and to how do we take responsibility for the collective on more nuanced levels? So I'm super interested in that conversation and that question, and that's some of what we'll be discussing in the course.
So beautifully said, Lee. I have been fortunate enough to be in this course with you a couple of times, and it is so rich and so deep, and I'm so grateful to have you as our knowledgeable and warm guide in this journey. So thank you, Lee. I'm curious more about your story on your communitarian journey. Did you grow up, or how much did you, did you grow up with much community in your life? And also wondering about when you decided to seek and join community. Can you give us a little more background on that?
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, and just to touch base on the last piece you said, which is, I like to think of myself as an ongoing student of the collective, right? I never think of myself as an expert because groups are, we are all changing every minute and groups are in constant motion, right? And so every time I step into some kind of group experience, I am at my edge of learning constantly. So I will just say that there's no experts here. And the thing I love the most is finding leaning into the sacred inquiry. What are the most alive questions for each of us? And my guess is and my experience, when we get into a group, the most alive questions for any of us are also pretty sparky for the rest of us. And so I love that piece about doing this inquiry together. So I'll just say that. And yes, to your question, thank you. I grew up in an immigrant family. I was born in the late 1960s, and my grandparents had immigrated on both sides and from Italy and Eastern Europe. And so I still had family that spoke the mother tongue and really had food traditions and gardening traditions that really bespoke of the old world. And I don't think it took me a long time to realize what a gift that was for my life and how it oriented me to think in the collective framework. Because it wasn't yet, by the time I came along, there was certainly a push to modernize and certainly a push to have some of these old world traditions die out. Grocery stores had everything available. But yeah, there were still so many beautiful, mostly food traditions in my family. I was pushed to go to college as the first generation to go to college and work in the corporate world. So there was a push away, but I was steeped deeply enough in being raised by my grandparents and extended family and cousins that was very much an old world style. And so I see how it influenced me. A large part of what I've done in community is farm and has sort of food as the center pole of much of what I've done. And so that certainly comes from my upbringing, but also the idea that we are in this together and we are responsible for the success of the whole came, I believe, from that extended family mindset and that sort of old world way of thinking. And then when I did go to college and then sort of came out the other side of that, worked in the corporate world a bit, and I felt pretty disillusioned and disappointed by what seemed like a really dead culture. And I was sort of a seeker. I think of myself as a seeker my whole life, and I was getting into progressive news magazines and spiritual life, that I would go to an ashram and go do yoga, but my life seemed so compartmentalized. Over here I was making money, and over here I was involved in a community garden, and things seemed so separate and disparate. And I thought, gosh, where is the integration or alignment possible? And I came across the communities directory, which at that point was a big fat book in the 90s, and it's now this really robust database on the FIC site, which I love so much. You helped done such a good job. And I believe there's still a print book as well, still the big fat book.
Yeah.
And in the early 90s, a few of the FEC communities started getting online. They were the first ones because there were some geeky programming sorts of people putting, probably Dancing Rabbit folks. And so the FEC stands for the Federation of Egalitarian Communities, and there's a subgroup of communities in the United States that do income sharing, egalitarian style. And I was really drawn to that model. And so I landed at Twin Oaks, and I landed at Acorn, and I landed at East Wind, and I sort of did a tour across the country of the egalitarian communities. And that was a series of a number of years. And then I ended up deciding I wanted to be doing an eco-village. I wanted to be living in an eco-village and have more of a focus for me on farming, as well as sort of the ecological perspective. And sort of the ecology as spirituality, as a guide and spirituality. And so I ended up at Earth Haven Eco Village in Western North Carolina in 98, 99, and have been there since.
Well, thank you, Lee. I resonate with parts of your journey. Yes, thank you so much for sharing. I'm also curious to know about any surprising learnings you had in your early community life.
Yeah. Well, stepping out of, going to a public school and sort of, more of a mainstream life, there was so much learning, right? I learned what I would call counterculture values, right? That stepping into community is somewhat shocking sometimes, like good surprising from my perspective, but transparency and inclusion and participation, and hey, here's all our accounting. And when you step into an egalitarian community, and once you become a member, you're included in the decision-making process right from the get-go, and the income sharing process. And that just felt amazing to me. I mean, like, I'm just like going to step into this thing and be a fully participating member and have a voice right from the get-go. And yeah, that was compelling and surprising. I also over the years sort of learned about how divorced we are from land-based wisdom and from the knowledge needed to build these sort of coherent systems, and really how our human relationships inside of community are just as fraught with the same challenges as human relationships outside of community. I think there's maybe a projection or an illusion that people in community somehow have it figured out, and that just has not been my experience, really. We might have more access to tools and some shared reality about how to use those tools and some common understandings about how we might want to work through things. But really, we are dealing with much of the same things people in the world are. Very early on, I was at a community called Acorn in Central Virginia and worked at the Southern Exposure Seed Exchange business, which had just been purchased, and it was sort of this collective business. And I came with a bunch of business background, a degree in marketing and finance and accounting, and so I was able to sort of drop into a manager level role in that seed business, which was pretty awesome for me. And sort of realizing that a lot of people were drawn to community didn't have those business skills. And so I was able to hit the ground running with a level of contribution that felt really inspiring to me and important, and then sort of learn and pick up all the other things that I didn't know as much about. So much learning.
So true. So true.
Yeah.
I want to remind everyone that we are taking questions from the audience as well. So feel free to type those in the Q&A or raise your hand. But while we're waiting on those questions, I'd like to get more into cooperative culture and what that means. Can you share a little more about that and maybe what skills one should learn to be best prepared for living in community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's how much of the Becoming a Communitarian 5-week course is structured around, which is what skill sets should I really lean into to be able to thrive in community. I have a friend at Earth Haven Eco Village that calls community living a decathlon, at least in our context, right? You have to be really, really good at like 10 or more things. Not just sort of okay, but like quite good. And, that's especially true in a rural place-based situation that we're in, where, the sort of bioregional approach where we're getting really intimate with the piece of land and building our own shelters and creating our own water systems and off-grid utility systems and building our homes. That has taken a huge, huge learning curve, and not every community is set up that way. And then farming and all of the aspects of farming, the animal husbandry pieces, and fixing the tractor and the mechanics and putting up fences, and all of that stuff has been quite a journey for us. But the growth curve in the social, emotional, relational components are pretty big as well. We come from a culture that sort of embraces the idea that good fences make good neighbors, right? And the compartmentalizes, like, this is our nuclear family, and this is the school system, and this is my workplace, and there's not a lot of integration. So, gosh, yeah, another piece to say is that we've been separated from each other, whether that's been intentional or unintentional through our cultural process. We've been separated from each other. When you look at a traditional peoples, they are often not living in nuclear family systems. And in fact, when traditional peoples went from sort of tribal cultural systems, and the culture was sort of wanting to be broken apart by whoever was in charge, they put people in nuclear family systems, right? So there's a lot of separation there. So there's so much to learn about how we come with the cultural narratives and cultural belief systems that keep us separate, and the sort of mountain it is to climb to work through our own stuff about that, to really offer the gifts that we have and also be willing to receive in community. And so building trust, I talk a lot in the Becoming a Communitarian piece about unwinding the trauma in our own systems, learning to inhabit our bodies, learning to trust ourselves, learning to understand our own self-regulation. These are sort of buzzwords that are coming out. Peter Levine's work and Gabor Mate's work with trauma. This is sort of the basis of relating, is how do we identify the places where we're not fully grown up, where we're not fully inhabiting ourselves, and then sort of learn to inflate those places so that we can show up with our best selves in community. So cooperative culture is, we're all holding the sacred blanket together. And how do we do that for the highest good of the whole, really, in service to the whole? And when we can be in true service to the whole, it is in true service to ourselves in a really abundant and profound way.
Just taking a moment to sit with that. That's so beautifully said, Lee. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions from the audience yet, so I'll hit you with some more questions if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Oh, here we have one from Owner. Do you know where your clothes were made? We are so far away from such things, and it's a journey.
Yeah, I love that. Each community has its own reference point, its own vision and mission. And at Earth Haven Eco Village, where I've sort of come up, grown up, shaped who I am, we very much have wanted to take responsibility for the consequences of our lives, right? And bring that into our lived experience. So instead of exporting where our water comes from, not knowing where our power comes from, not knowing where our building materials come from, we sort of, or very early on, took all of that, decided to take into our lived experience responsibility for that. And that was and is a very idealistic, ambitious, tall order. And part of what happened, I think, for me and for many others, is we bit off more than we could chew early on, and there was a lot of burnout. And so I wouldn't recommend all of that. I often talk about, a book that maybe I'll write someday, which is What Not to Do. And that's sort of one of the things to not do, is to try to accomplish it all in a given lifetime. And one of the things I talk about in the Becoming a Communitarian course are these sort of helpful attitudes. And one of the helpful attitudes that I talk about is it's a 400-year cathedral. The idea that we are so divorced from the land base and in harmony with, like you're saying, knowing where, making our own clothes, making our own food, building our own homes, creating our own governance systems, resolving our own conflicts, that we need to think of this as a multi-generational project, much like these beautiful 400-year cathedrals in Europe that were or these grand temples in the Aztec world, or in other places, the Middle East and other places, of like these are multi-generational projects, and where we are headed is a place that's very, very different than where we sit and where we come from. And so how can we look at this as what's ours to do at this, in this place, in this time, without burning ourselves out, without collapsing the movement because we're all so stressed, right? So what's ours to do at this time in this generation? How do we lay the groundwork for what's to come next? You know, and the Notre Dame Cathedral was at, I don't know, 270 years in the making. These are the kinds of spaces in deep time that we don't have a lot of access to in our culture because we're so oriented to instant gratification and personal fulfillment, which isn't necessarily all a bad thing. But how do we balance that with where are we going as a collective, and how do we get there in as much integrity and with as much joy as we possibly can? Those pieces, those latter pieces of integrity and joy have been added on for me much later as I burnt myself out over many cycles of having too much ambition and not understanding how hard it would be. I think that's one of the places of ignorance that I came from as a modern person, is thinking that a land-based life would be easy, because that's how disconnected I was from the reality of that. You know, thinking cooperative culture must be easy. And so I talk a lot about the gift of disillusionment, how it is that when we are disillusioned, we can then start living into the reality of what's possible instead of running at a thing with illusions. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate your ability to reframe those types of situations. So thank you, Leah, and appreciate that question, owner. Leah, I'm wondering what advice you might give others for people who are looking to join an intentional community or build one.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect question on the heels of what I just said, which is we come to it thinking, you know, we have a bright idea of like, oh, let's start a community, or oh, let's join a community. And it's a big deal. You know, it's starting a community, I would say, is on par with, you know, parenting. And on par with like writing a book or some, you know, really monumental thing that we would do in our lives. And it's not a small endeavor. There's the financial considerations, the legal considerations, and then the most complicated piece is the human relational considerations. And anybody who's ever gotten a group of people together to say, hey, let's talk about community, knows that if there's 20 people in the room, there's 20 different versions of what that wants to look like. And so how to synthesize and coalesce that into something that actually manifests, right? I think there was this statistic, and Lauren, you may know this better than I do, but you know, for years, it was always like 9 out of 10 restaurants that open are going to fail within the first 2 years or something, right? And like a similar statistic for groups that are like, I want to start an intentional community, you know, like what are the percentages chance that they actually get to the starting line and they actually sort of get on the land and actually sort of start to get the community going. So the stakes are high and the effort is big. And, you know, my suggestion is like, sit at the feet of people who have done it, visit the communities where they're actually still going. I mean, succeeding is a tricky word. What does success even mean? If it's around for 50 years, but everyone hates each other, I don't know how much success that is, right? So, but like many of these things, you know, even the conversation about, hey, let's do this. And even if you're in that conversation for a couple of years and it all falls apart, so much learning happens, right? And then you can apply that learning to other pieces. I have a lot to say on this topic. One of the pieces I often encourage people to do is find community right where you are. If you can't or don't want to, or it's too big of a step to join a residential community, community is all around us, right? Potlucks, book groups, discussion salons, transition networks, And I have a strong invitation to get it offline and in the real world. Right now, people are more and more coming back together again after all the shutdowns we've lived through. But it really is all around. And I'm super lucky to live in Asheville, North Carolina, where there's more to do in a given evening than it's hard to choose sometimes because there's so much community happening. So the communities movement and the directory on the FIC site, if you're actually looking for a residential community, intentional community, absolutely. There's just like gobs of information, co-housing and communes and spiritual communities and elder communities, so much amazing, exciting stuff going on. And if you're in a town, a rural area or a city, there are also people there who want to build community. So there's so much to do that's, that can happen at the grassroots level, wherever you are. And then if you're interested in a residential intentional community, I would say start visiting them, start looking up their websites, start communicating with them. There is so much information to be gained by spending a week at a community. If you have a vacation time or if you're traveling about, and you can, usually it requires one to reach out ahead of time and say, hey, I want to visit in a couple of months. Can I camp there? Or do you have a place for me to stay? And sort of line those up. And then, if you do that for a month even, or even a month spread out over a year, where you will be in your understanding of what's possible will be light years ahead of where you are now. So that's my big advice. Think of it like the slow food movement. This is a deepening of relationship and intimacy with a movement that's been around for decades. It's like a dating process. Can you start to date some of these communities, and then very quickly you will realize, I really do not like this structure, and I really much more prefer this structure. Like the income sharing community is way too close. I want to live in co-housing. I want more separation or distance. Like, listen to those voices, listen to those places in you that are being drawn to the things that are yeses and nos. So think of it like a dating process. The FIC is just hands down the best resource out there, ic.org. And then there's the whole eco-village, the global eco-village network, which, there's some overlap. The FIC also covers eco-villages and highlights eco-villages, but the global eco-village network specifically focuses on eco-villages around the world. If you have the resources and the time to visit intentional communities in other countries, it's just so much to learn. I'd say, Cynthia's class on finding community, take that class, going through the characteristics of what are essential for you, what kinds of things you're willing to live without, what you're not willing to live without. Some communities have pet policies that aren't really jiving with where people are with their pets. Other people are really specific about agriculture or urban or rural. So I would spend as much time as possible in that inquiry phase up front, because if you jump in and you get in and then you're disappointed and disillusioned, it's harder to get out. So that's my advice. And in terms of starting communities, I'd say it's definitely not for the faint of heart. And if you want to start one, see if you can glean. Lauren, you can speak to the classes that you all offer, but glean as much as you can about the legal, financial, relational implications of those things before you learn from other people's mistakes, I think is the biggest advice I can give here.
Yeah, thank you, Lee.
About that, Lauren.
Yeah, and we do, Lee had offered had mentioned our Finding Community course. We also have a Starting Community course as well, and that really gives you a good understanding of what's included in community. And if you may take the course and decide that you don't want to start a community, you may decide, oh, I actually want to join one that already exists. But whatever the case, there's a community out there for you. Thank you, Lee.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question. What keeps you committed to living in community, even though it's such a struggle on many levels?
Oh, that's a great one. I mean, I think struggle helps us figure out who we are. I think hardship help hone and shape us, right? And I don't think we enter it for struggle. Well, I think we enter, and I can speak for myself, I enter it because I have a North Star, and the North Star is there's got to be something better than this culture I've been handed, right? There's got to be something that is, there's got to be something that's saner, more integrated, more reverent, more beautiful. The more beautiful world, Charles Eisenstein's book, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. That thing, that's why. Because the vision is an elevated vision, and what are the other options? Sort of, being with the thing that is not satisfying, right? We all do that to whatever extent. But for me, keeping my eye on the more beautiful world my heart knows is possible is worth any kind of hardship. And the hardship is what forms the human and what forms the collective. And in some ways, it's sort of the hero's journey, which is we have an inspiration, we have a vision of this beautiful world, and we know that the quest is the only thing that we can dedicate our lives to. What else is there?
Ooh, that's hitting home for me, Lee. Yeah, and that actually leads me into another question I wanted to ask you. Conflicts is going to happen in community, and it's hard, and I've been really trying to reframe it as a way to deepen my relationships with people and be less conflict avoidant. And so I'm wondering, how do you handle conflict in community?
Yeah, I can speak about me in a second. Maybe I'll come at it from a little bit of a macro view, which is exactly what you just said, Lauren, and every community person will know this. It's not a matter of if conflict, it's a matter of when conflict and how conflict. So, from my community experience in community, at our best, we are mature and we hear each other and we have empathy and understanding, and we have the creative flow where we bring all the perspectives into the place and then sort of work together to find solutions at our best. And at our worst, we throw temper tantrums and have disagreements and shut down and slam doors and do all of the things that humans normally do, right? Like there's no difference in a way. And thankfully, we have a group of people so that if one of us is regressed, then others might not be, right? So that's the ideal in a marriage as well, is like if one of you is freaked out, hopefully the other can hold the center. So, and in community, many of us have studied similar things. So in our community, we have studied for many, many years nonviolent communication. And so we can sort of use that system. It's our infrastructure. It's our relational and conflict infrastructure. Like if we're going to start to have a rub here, let's drop in. What are you feeling? What are you needing? How can I offer empathy? And then let's take turns. And I'm going to have to speak to what's up for me. And we go back and forth, right? So we have some frameworks. We have some systems in place that can help us navigate conflict. And we have heart share systems or restorative justice, restorative conflict systems. So we've tried, I don't know, probably dozens of systems over the year, the Zig Forum and process work, and you name it, we've tried it. And then we've sort of settled on some of these things that work for the majority of the people in community, that have sort of become part of our cultural topsoil or our culture in community. So we sort of can rely on these things. That being said, we still have challenges in community with different perspectives on conflict, right? And sometimes that can be described through looking at ethnicities and culture. We have some people that come from ethnicities and cultural backgrounds that feel really excited about getting in there and having conflict and using conflict to work through stuff. Then we have other people from different ethnicities and different cultural backgrounds, different parts of the country, different family systems that think, no, that's not how we did things in my family. We pushed that stuff right under the rug and we did not talk about that. And we certainly did not come at that directly and confront each other about things. And you can imagine getting these two different kinds of people in a room, there would be a lot of challenge about how to navigate that. So that is an ongoing negotiation in community where we sort of move towards each other. I tend to, because of my cultural background, growing up in an Italian culture and family, we have no problem being confrontational and having conflict with each other. So I was often on the side of, well, let's just talk about it. Let's just use this as an opportunity. And yet I came, because of that tendency and because of my confidence in that realm, I would sometimes run people over. And I would sometimes, chase people from the room because of my inviting this conflict. So I really had to learn to turn the volume down on my willingness to step into conflict, to make sure there was room for other people to be nervous about that or reluctant or resistant and needing to come at that in a softer way. So I've had to learn to move more towards the middle. And then there's people even sort of on the spectrum of things, even beyond me, who are excited about conflict and sort of stir the pot and provoke and create conflict because that's intimacy to them. And I don't usually go that far, but I can relate to that. And so often I was in this middle of like, okay, I see where you're coming from of wanting to stir the pot and get all this stuff stirred up so you can talk about it, but that's freaking all these other people out, right? So this is an ongoing process of, the sort of the cauldron, the soup pot of community. It's part of what we're dealing with on a daily basis. And there's so much to say about that. We tend to find in community, like such a community like Earth Haven Eco Village, where we have about 150 people in our valley, we subgroup. We have subgroups of friends, we have subgroups of committees, we have subgroup of work partners, we have subgroups. We tend to orient towards the kinds of people who are more like us, right? And that also, there can be conflicts between these groups of people. Well, we see it this way, and we see it this way. It's a very common thing in community. And so the intentional and conscious design about how not to fragment off too fully into these subgroups, it's going to happen. So how do we design it in the best ways to honor it, but also make sure we come together and don't other a different group or make enemies out of a different group? And this takes constant tending, much like a garden.
Absolutely. Boy, this is such a juicy topic. Thank you for that, Lee. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. We have a question from Hope. Hi, Hope. Glad you're here. Hope's question is, what does leadership look like in cooperative culture?
Really good one. Really, really good one. I'm going to answer it in a similar way, which is at our best and at our worst. At our best, we really understand that leaders are, I would say servants of the commons, stewards and servants, right? And that we, honor them and support them. And we don't sort of shoot arrows in their backs, right? At our best. And the best leaders are the ones who are constantly asking, what does the collective want and need here, right? So leadership in our culture, in our larger culture, sort of looks like taking the bullhorn and the trumpet and leading the charge forward. I got this. I know where we're going. I'm headed there. Like, follow me. That's often the archetype of leadership. And in community, it's actually quite different. It's actually this idea of, I'm going to take some leadership here for either facilitating this meeting or taking notes or driving this committee or making sure this project gets done. But what I need to do is listen to all the voices. I need to listen to all the voices and then synthesize that and sometimes make some hard decisions. There's a balance between how inclusive we want to be, which slows the process down, and how efficient we want to be, which can leave people out. This is the fine art of leadership in community and leadership in sort of non-hierarchical systems. We're so corrupted by hierarchy, which, you know, at its root, the word hierarchy is like a sacred lineage, sacred. But we've corrupted that very much in our larger culture, and we have given power to people in leadership, undue power and influence and reward. And so in community, it really does flip that on its head, and it's more, the leaders have to be resourced and resilient enough to serve the collective. And often it's getting out of the way, having good ideas, having opinions, having you know, directions and design, but also melding that with what everyone else in the circle is wanting, and really starting to hear and listen and see through the lens of what's best for the whole, which means I'm not always going to, as a leader, I'm not always going to get what I want. In fact, I might get very little of what I want, but because I'm in process, that what I want is morphing and changing because it's also influenced by what everyone else wants, while I also, as a leader, keep my eye on what's the vision here, what's the goal, what's the outcome, what did we say we wanted, and sort of keeping task to that. So it's an advanced skill in community. Yeah, and at our worst in community, we burn people out, people who are willing to step in and do the thing and take it on and do the admin and the accounting or the project management or the site coordination or whatever it is. And we don't pay them well enough, or we don't appreciate them enough, or we see their flaws instead of their gifts. And then they're like, forget it. I'm not doing this anymore. And that's happened a good amount. Cultivating leaders, young people in particular, who want to step up and learn to facilitate, or learn to farm, or learn to do any number of things that are needed in community. You know, how do we, as elders and as more experienced people, really embrace that and orient people and support people to step into leadership. And one of the things that I do as someone who's a little bit detached from community these days, I'm not full-time in community, and I'm also you know, sort of a baby elder at this point. I've been in community a long time. So whenever I see young people, especially stepping up into leadership, it's just like, how do I heap them with as much praise and as much support and as much encouragement as we possibly can, because that is not an easy position. And one of the things that's so exciting at Earth Haven Eco Village right now is that all of our officers, and we have these sort of nested HOA and community associations, but we have 8 officers, and they're all young people, you know, sort of under 40 kind of young people, which is just, to me, an incredible sign that something's working well in community. When you have young people with busy lives and careers and families and all kinds of things they could be doing, stepping up to take responsibility in the community. And that's a far cry from where we were 20 years ago, where we had mostly the elders and the founders, and no one felt like they could sort of get a say. And so we've shifted that over the course of a couple of decades, and I think it's one of the indicators of health and vitality in our community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what it sounds like. That's awesome. Thank you so much for that question, Hope. So we're winding down the session. We just have a few minutes left. So Lee, I wanted to chat with you a little more about the course. I know that you offer a lot of things through Reclaiming Wisdom, and I'm wondering what made you decide to teach the Becoming a Communitarian course as part of FIC's programs, and any key learnings you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, I mean, I touched on that a little bit earlier, and how it sort of grew out of needing a roadmap for people coming into our community who were like, what have I gotten myself into? What is going on here? And, really the roadmap has to do with the relational resilience, the idea of like, oh, here I am with all that I've been given by culture, feeling fairly unprepared to do the social relationships that I'm being asked to do in consciousness, right? So it's in some ways it's a path towards conscious personal mastery, this class of like, how do I grow myself up, realize how I've been impacted and influenced by culture, and then sort of move towards being a steward of this thing that we all care about, right? One of the other attitudes that I talk about in this course is with regards to our eco-village and any community is we are the parents, not the child. We are all holding this precious thing, this precious project as parents, as co-parents. And so as co-parents, we really need to have a level of self-awareness and skills in the cooperative realm to parent this thing that we're building, because this is the new cathedral. This is the 400-year cathedral that is worth building, that whole, the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. This is what we're holding. And so, it's an introduction, and hopefully to ignite people into what pathways, what systems, what avenues are they lit up about that can help them find their way towards their yes. Where do they want to stand in relationship to their stewardship of the commons, whether that's in residential intentional community or not, or in communities of other sorts. So I have a lot of, I geek out about this stuff, and there's not one roadmap and there's not one recipe, but this opens many doors to start thinking about the skills and resources we need to gather to be who we want to be and to go where we want to go in this sort of new culture we're creating.
Thank you, Lee. So we are at time here, so I'll just close this out by again thanking you, Lee. I really appreciate all of the opportunities to be in Zoom land with you and to hear from your experience and to learn more about myself in the process. So thank you so much, Lee. And thank you. Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. If we don't see you in the course, we do hope to see you in Zoom land again soon. So please take care, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Lauren. Bye, everyone.